Okay, hello. Welcome to another edition of Sporting Heritage in Conversation. Sporting Heritage are working on a number of different programmes connected to the Women's Euros 2022, which has taken place this July across England, and we're really delighted to be involved. One of the programmes is to support the delivery of heritage activity for one of the host cities, Sheffield, which has been kindly funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And these in conversations are part of that activity. My name is Verity Smith, and I'm an associate consultant with Sporting Heritage. And today I'm in conversation with Dr. Gary James, an academic who has written extensively on football, including female participation and involvement in the sport. So, hi, Gary.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you very much for joining us today. We're going to have a chat about Gary's involvement in the Euros. He's actually working with the team in Trafford on the delivery of their heritage activity. But I know that we've got similar activities going on, and he can also talk about where we're up to with the women's game at the moment and a little bit about how that's changed in recent years. So if we can begin, Gary, by kind of looking at what the challenges and issues are with the women's game today and sort of how they're reflected in the game locally, and also your experience of Sheffield in that respect.
I think that there's a number of challenges with the women's game, and I think it's in a strong position in many ways because of what we see as the WSL and England and the Euros and so on. So that's all positive. And, you know, in recent weeks, we've had incredible crowds in Barcelona and in Madrid. Certainly in Spain, we've had a number of significant crowds. The crowds at Barcelona were 90-odd thousand. And in Newcastle, only this last week or so, we've had 22,000 crowds. So that sounds really good and really positive. However, what's important is to make sure that filters down all the way. And that's the real sort of issue for the game, in that we don't want it to be top heavy, if you like, where there's lots of attention, lots of money in comparison to the past. I'm not going to say there's lots of money in the women's game, but in comparison to the past, and then lower down beyond that sort of tip of the iceberg, if you like, beyond that, there's all these clubs and teams and areas where women's football is struggling because it's not getting the support, the financial support or anything else. It's not filtering down. So that does worry me for the future. You sort of think that unfortunately, a bit like men's football, we don't want a situation where, say, the men's Premier League takes everything and nothing goes below. And I think that there's a danger that the WSL and the structure of women's football could go that way. Hopefully not, but it's very important for the teams that are and the FA to actually think about that pyramid and to make sure the pyramid is strong, because if the pyramid isn't strong, ultimately the top will not sustain itself.
What do you think are the things that go into making that pyramid strong and to avoiding the issues that?
Well, there's making sure there's an investment in academy style, training facilities, making sure those facilities are then available to local clubs, local schools groups and so on. So, I know in the north, in Sheffield and in Manchester, the teams that are at the peak, if you like, or trying to be at the peak, are looking below that sort of structure. But I'm not certain that's always the case nationwide. And there are stories of clubs where they've suddenly stopped investing in women's game, thinking, we're not really getting what we want. I think, and it's a really strange thing, this, because people will say, football, you've got to look at the sort of size crowds you get, and you've got to look at this, and you've got to look at that. No. What you've got to do is actually invest and build something that has a strong structure. And ultimately, the life develops from that. I think I'm a little bit biased because I see what's happened at Manchester City, and I know that their women's facilities are available to walking football groups, to community groups, to all sorts of groups along the way. I know that, for example, a few years back, about 6 years ago now, 5 years ago, I bought a pack of top trumps for my nephew, which was supposed to be Manchester City, so men's team basically. I opened a pack of top trumps, and in there were it was only about 4 or 5, but there were women players from the WSL team. And I know that sounds like a really sort of minor point, but the fact was that meant that for my nephew, he was able to look at that and go, "Oh, Steph Orton can beat Vincent Kompany on this."
Yes. It's as normal for girls as it is for boys.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I don't want there to be a women's Super League that is distanced from the grassroots, but also you do need that ambition and you do need that investment and so on.
Absolutely. Why do you think that's been a success in Manchester and perhaps not in other places? Do you think that's?
I think it was the investment, simply the investment. I mean, there was a history of women's football at Manchester City going back to 1988. My wife used to play for the team in the first 4 seasons. She scored in the first ever game of the club. And I used to go and watch. I used to go and watch the team back then. And like the majority of women's clubs at the time, it was obviously just a park pitch, typically. They did play. The very first game was at Boundary Park, which was Oldham Athletics ground. Yeah. But that's a bit of an outlier, really. The truth is that most of the games were typical sort of park pitches, Sunday football pitches, putting the nets up. There could be a mess on the pitch. There could be all sorts of problems. Basically relying on the women to do the work to make sure they could play, paying the subs, doing all that. And that Manchester City women's team sort of went from that and kept on going. And it did progress. It never quite reached the heights that, say, the Arsenal women's team did, because the club didn't get the same level of investment for most of those years as the Arsenal team did. And then in recent years, they started to get the investment, and the club took a different approach. They decided that the women and the men would use the same training facilities for a start, and not just when we finished, from the start. They decided that they would try, and if they did a kit launch or whatever, it would be a kit launch for men and women at the same time.
So you're kind of giving equal opportunity,
equal. And
equal time
idea, and had that idea from the start that football is for all. Football, and it sounds so obvious, and it is obvious, but sadly, so many other teams just didn't do that. And I know lots of clubs have started to take that approach, and that's good, but it needs that all the way down. And obviously, not every club has got the money to invest in the way that Manchester City did. But what City tended to do was say, you know what, women's football may actually cost us some money at the moment, but does it really? Because it's bringing in different sorts of fans, a different range of fans. Young families might be going to the women's game who may not be going to the men's game. It's developing a better sort of overall club brand, and bottom line is it's just good to do.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Have you seen some of those similar things in Sheffield? I mean, what's your experience of football in Sheffield specifically? Just thinking about how people engage in the game across the city, and certainly speaking to people who've got experience of the women's game. How do you think that compares?
I think the bottom line is that, and this may be a northern thing, but the bottom line is that Sheffield has a proud football history, and going way back in many ways, you could argue it, that Sheffield is the city that sort of created certainly the men's version of professional football that developed. So Sheffield's an incredible city for football, and when you look at women's clubs across Sheffield, across Northern England, they all still rely on dedicated players, dedicated committee people, dedicated, but the good thing is that clubs, the men's clubs, are taking a stronger interest now than they've ever done. And I'm not, Yorkshire itself has been a great county for women's football. I mean, obviously Doncaster Belles are huge role models and so on. But I think in general, women from northern cities have had to fight more for their football than perhaps they have in certain parts of England. I best be careful what I say there. But, if you talk about, say, first England teams, if you talk about England teams in the 80s, 90s and so on, every time I've interviewed anyone who was of a certain standard playing in the north, they've always talked about a bit of a divide between the north and south.
Okay, it's kind of been reflected in, because my next kind of question was going to come on to, what do you think the progress that has been made in terms of stereotypes and discriminative attitudes? And do you think actually geography has also had a part to play?
I think geography
is gender.
Well, I think, do you know what? Geography is really important because if you look through the history of, let's just talk about the history of women's football going way back, right? Northern factories were where the women's teams tended to develop, right? Mm-hmm. And when when the ban came into place in 1921 by the FA, there's all sorts of different arguments that have gone into this and so on. But one of the general theories is that women's football was sort of becoming popular and usually popular, and the men wanted to stop it and so on. Well, there's lots of angles to that, but one of the parts of that I sort of strongly agree with really is that it wasn't just that it was becoming popular, it was becoming popular down the levels, right? Mm-hmm. So when it came to using just a common garden football pitch, I don't mean a professional league club, I mean a ground, just a normal ground, Sunday Park pitch perhaps, or whatever. Yeah. Successful women's teams wanted those pitches. Men's teams wanted those pitches. So I think the issue was actually not that at the top, it was lower down. Now, women in the north were the ones who had factories, who came from factory teams and so on in the main. In southern England, some of the newspaper articles actually say this ban will not affect women's teams in the south. And the reason was because some of those teams came from the equivalent of girls' colleges, clubs,
okay, and that, right? So really,
which is a different thing. So I think the fact is that women working in factories, which tended to be the northern munitions factories, tended to be the sort of big engineering type of works in World War One. They were the ones who started playing football, Huddersfield, Atalanta, and so on. They were the ones that were doing that and developing that, and they were the ones who were going to be affected because they couldn't get to use these pitches that they didn't own, whereas in the south it was perceived that there was some sort of team ownership. It's a long way to go to sort of get
okay, but actually that's highlighting differences in social class and
absolutely, yeah, and that then carries on. There's always perceptions in there about north and south and working class and middle class and so on, and I think that does carry on. And certainly the other thing that does affect all sports really is that when a sport is developing and growing, quite often when it comes to national teams or comes to regional competition or whatever, it's connections that make that develop, and sporting connections are what made men's football grow back in the 1860s, 70s and so on. It was men's football connections that made that grow. And it's the same sort of thing with women's football. It was women's football, quite often a group of women would go off and create another team or whatever. But also when it came to England or came to touring teams or whatever, it'd be, oh, I know her, she can play, and
yeah. So actually relying on a lot of connections. In terms of the things that you think have progressed and the differences today, what do you think are the things that have changed the game for women and broken down some of those barriers? Because obviously there are, a lot of challenges that are still prominent for women in football or wanting to get into football. But what are the things that you think have have made progress on, and perhaps are there any instances you've seen in Sheffield specifically of that as well?
I think when you look at what are the instances of things that have changed or what's happened, it's publicity, it's wider recognition about the game. It's the idea that, way back in, was it 89, the Women's FA Cup final was shown. That one was at Old Trafford, actually, but the Women's FA Cup final was shown on television and it got something like 4 million viewers, right? Yeah. So that recognition, that helps. Obviously, when you talk to anyone who's, whether it's somebody from fairly recent years or as a player or going back, it's the attitudes within schools that have changed. So it's, you've gone from girls cannot play football, girls cannot appear on the boys' team, if you like, to actually at primary school level, things have improved. There are issues, we know there are issues, there's certain issues at secondary school level as well. But it's those little opportunities that have happened. But more than anything, it's the role models that we've started to see over and over and over again. I've often said to people that women's football was banned for approximately 50 years. Imagine if men's football had been banned for those same sort of 50 years. So we're talking 1921 to about 1970, right? Yeah. No 1966 World Cup, no Jeff Hurst, no Bobby Charlton, no Nat Lofthouse, no, and you can go on and you can go on and go on. You wouldn't have had, by the time you get to 1970, 71, those men that were coming along the next generation wouldn't have had the role models at all. And so they'd be starting again. But not just that, there's the kit that wasn't read, that wouldn't have been developed in the way, because we know women's football kit didn't develop, did it?
No, exactly. So actually there's so many different aspects, not just about the game. Yeah. It's playing the game itself, but everything that goes around that. All that supporting industry. Football boots. Some of the women I've interviewed talk about how they had to pretend they were buying boots for the brother when they went to buy football boots because they wouldn't have been sold them. I've just done an interview today actually with Wendy Owen, who played for England. She's not from Sheffield or Manchester, but she ended up coaching in Chester. But she was part of the first ever England squad, and her stories were incredible. She had a PE teacher at a girls' college say to her, "Why do women play? Why would you play football? It's not a sport for women." So this was a teacher at a PE college for girls, and she's saying it's not a sport you should be playing. And this was when Wendy had been selected for England. She had to go ask for permission to basically go and play for England. Oh wow! Yeah,
I just and so okay, that's 1971, so it's 50 years ago. But I interviewed Jill Scott a couple of years back, and she said that when she was playing football, she was playing on a boys' team, if you like, but she's playing for the school team. She's the only girl there. And the parents of the opposition boys were shouting, kick the girl, because the girl was embarrassing their sons. It's just... So actually, it's still really important to have those role models. And, I think probably the current England team would see themselves as role models for, generations coming through. And it really sounds like it starts at primary school and having that recognition that actually it's a game for everybody. Well, one of the great questions to ask anyone is, who are your role models? Who are your heroes? And so for most of the women who are playing football, they talk about George Best, David Beckham, you can name him,
you can name a whole host of different people.
Exactly. Sometimes it could be Imre Verity, somebody who you think, oh, really? Right. But anyway, it can be, right? Now, occasionally, some of the younger women that you get to interview will talk about Jill Scott, Karen Bardsley, or whoever it may be. And you think that we're getting to that point now, thankfully, where there are proper role models.
Yeah, absolutely. That is really important. that brings me nicely on to this year's tournament. Obviously, it's brilliant for all of the host cities to be promoting women's football and the Euros tournament. What do you think the legacy will be from this tournament, or what do you think it will be, and what should it be?
I hope it's another one of those jumps forward, if you like. We get to a point where you sort of, every so often in life, I tend to think that you get to a point where you think, right, we've done that now. We've sort of, like on a video game when you reach the next level, yeah. And then you stay at that level, and a bit like that. And I like to think that this is the same sort of thing. We get to a level where it's commonplace to get the media coverage that it's going to get. It's commonplace to get crowds of the size they will get. I know there's debate about the size of stadiums and so on, but
yes,
the first game, 76,000 at Old Trafford. 76,000 sellout at Old Trafford is pretty remarkable. If the ground had been bigger, it would have been a bigger crowd.
Yeah.
Wembley, I don't know if Wembley's already sold out, but Wembley will be sold out.
Yeah, and obviously Wembley will be hosting the final.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So what we need is for those to become the norm. If the game at Newcastle the other day could get 22,000, then, which was in effect, what was it, a fourth tier game? But if that can happen, then hopefully this is the point to sort of say it can go. We all know that there's some people who watch men's football who are never really going to be interested in women's football. Just like there's some people who watch women's football who are never interested in men's football. It's just the way it is. That's fine. Yeah. And nobody ever says to people, you must watch women's football because you like men's football. Not at all. You don't have to. We accept that. But what it should do is people who've not been aware get to see it again. People get to understand it. And, I always find when you go to, when you experience something, a sport for the first time, maybe, if you get something out of it, if you see something, whether it's a player or whether it's just a great moment like that, you can be hooked for life, right? And I hope that happens to some people who wouldn't normally go to this. And we're not necessarily interested in those people who've made up their mind of what they think of the sport at any point. What we're interested in are the children and the young adults who have not been given the option to go to a game or to enjoy it. Yeah. So I'm hoping that this sets the level, and this is it. And not just English football, but, certainly all across Britain, but it develops. And I hope it develops in regions. And I think it's important as well, despite what I just said about the size of some of the venues, I think it's important as well that some of these games are being played in locations where perhaps they wouldn't have put men's European matches. And that's important because
absolutely, that's one of the first things I noticed, actually, that there were some venues that I thought, okay, that wouldn't be a typical venue for a tournament of the size of this if we were talking about the men's game. So I absolutely.
And I think the good thing about that is that then says to those communities, come and watch this incredible international tournament and participate in that. And I think that in itself is going to be good.
Yeah.
What I worry about is obviously, as with any show, any big sporting event, if a year later that legacy has sort of faded away. So I'm hoping not. I'm hoping that as part of the wider sort of heritage project that's with the Euros, that also we have enough stories captured that mean that future generations will get to hear what people went through to get to this level, to get to this point.
Yeah,
because I don't think we haven't ever captured those sort of stories in volume before, and I think that's important.
I know that's something that's happening in the activity in Sheffield, is that actually, we're keen to capture as many oral histories and stories as possible, and some of those are about how women's experiences of the game and actually the difficult circumstances that they came through in order to be able to play football. It sounds like you're kind of doing quite similar activity in that respect. I just wondered whether you could touch on some of the other things you're doing, particularly in Trafford as part of the heritage activity.
Yeah, I think what I'm trying to do is capture those stories, get them archived properly. So Trafford, it's a small well, so I don't know if it's small, but it's a borough. But there's a number of towns that are merged together, right? It's not got a women's football collection. So the number one thing, the number one task really is to get a women's football collection of images, objects, to be aware of newspaper reports, and to get those sound recordings and so on. So that's the main aim. We're going to put on an exhibition within an archive centre there. I'm conscious that Trafford is on the doorstep of Manchester and the National Football Museum, and they're going to do a much bigger exhibition and so on. So there's no point trying to compete. So what we're trying to do is something that's bespoke to Trafford. And I think probably Sheffield and Rotherham, it's a similar situation really, that you're on doorstep, if you like. So it's getting that balance between what can Sheffield do that won't stop Rotherham, and what can Rotherham do that will support Sheffield, if you know what I mean. It's a tricky situation.
It's about communities supporting each and not being in competition. Absolutely. I know that there's a lot
absolutely not being in competition and building those links really. As part of what I'm trying to do is get a full understanding of all women's football activity that's taking place now in the Trafford area, but also what was taking place in the past. And already we found, we know there was a game in 1895 in the Trafford area. People always think about Manchester United when we talk about Trafford, but that's basically a men's football club that just happens to race within the borough. The truth is that it's all these different towns, and in those different towns, they've all got their own identity and all got their own history.
Yes.
And we've got women's football going back to 1895, but there's some big games played at various sites within Trafford that were not Old Trafford. And it's incredible. And this is the same in Sheffield. There's going to be lots of activity within Sheffield that people won't even know about. There's a guy who did some research. He's actually, I think he's German, and he does research mostly on French women's football, a guy called Elga Falla. And he put some books together about a year ago, which are every instance of women's football that he's found in English towns.
Oh, wow.
And there are definitely Sheffield games throughout that. Right. Now, obviously, he's based it on the British Newspaper Archive, so he's based it on online searches. One thing I found, which is fairly obvious to any of us, is we need to get into the Sheffield Star and the newspaper. Was it the Green and the old sports newspaper? Quite often, some of those are not digitised at all, but they're the ones where women's football will appear as typically a photograph, which may or may not be politically correct in some ways, but typically a photograph and then a story underneath. So in Trafford, for example, I was going through just newspapers from the 1970s that will never be digitised and are just local newspapers. And I found about 6 stories within about 2 or 3 years where this pub has created a ladies' football team, as they called it, back in 1971. That's interesting. Here is such a body who is setting up a game for charity of ladies' football, blah, blah, blah. And these sort of stories appear quite often, but they're not on the football pages, they're on the gossip pages or the news pages or whatever. And if you go through every issue, and it's going to be a laborious task, but if you go through every issue of every Sheffield newspaper that's not been digitised, there will be all sorts of information.
Yeah, and I know that certain things have been uncovered already in terms of, colleagues in the Sheffield borough, they've uncovered things from the 19th century that don't have a lot of information with them, but then, there were photographs of women playing football. So we know it goes, right back to the beginning, and it hasn't just been the last 50 years, I suppose. So that sounds fascinating. And is that something you're going to carry on as part of your ongoing research? Just wondered if you could touch on your own research aside from
So I did I've had an interest in women's football since first going to watch my wife, who was my girlfriend then, go and play. And I used to stand on the touchline while she was playing, and I'd be, sometimes carrying the bucket and running on and doing all this sort of stuff. But I can't play football. I'm hopeless at football, but I love football. And so I've written quite a lot of football history books on men's football. But even in the very first book I did, which was back in 1989, I had a page which mentioned women's football. That's all it was. It was only a page, but it was something that I wanted to get in there because I thought it was a landmark moment, and it was at the time. So a few years back, I did a project capturing stories of women who played for the original Manchester City's women's team, which lasted for, well, it's still going, but 30 odd years. So I did a book on that. And what I wanted to do was follow that up with a study of women and football. So it's not just playing football, it's about women involved in football in whatever way they're involved. So the idea is that supporters, people who wash the kit, people who are directors now or communications officers, broadcasters, as well as women who play football and document this history. I'm focused on that on Manchester because that was the area of research, if you like. It'll be a couple of years before that comes out. But all of this that we're doing now is part of that same sort of story.
Into that. And actually, it's about all aspects of involvement, isn't it?
Absolutely, because you talk it's happened. It's true in Sheffield, it's true in Manchester, it's true in Glasgow, wherever. If you interview anyone who's played football, they'll talk about the efforts of their parents. They'll talk about how the mum perhaps used to make sandwiches for the team or whatever. And they talk about their brothers and the sisters. They'll talk about somebody taking them to a game. They'll talk about their partners, male, female partners, whoever, right? And it's a whole community. But we sort of know what men have done in football because there's been lots and lots written and published. But the women's voices, who perhaps without the women, a lot of those men's games would never have taken place. They need to be told. So that's
it's once again an example of, I suppose, kind of women's history not told, women's stories not told, but actually, they've contributed a lot to their own game and the men's game, and it's giving recognition to that, isn't it? I think that's part of the heritage activity across England is about giving that voice to women's football and their experiences.
Absolutely, and one thing I was conscious of, and I really wanted to make sure happened. Obviously, I'm a man, right? So when I'm interviewing, when I'm talking about women's football, I don't want my voice to be the one that is important, because it's not. I'm just a person capturing the story. So when I did the book on the City women, the Manchester City women, I have to write paragraphs every so often linking something in.
Yes.
But my job was really to present those stories as they were told. So if somebody's talking about the obstacles they faced as a child trying to get to play football, I don't want me to write my version of what this person said. I want it to be that person's actual words. That's what they said. That's how they felt. That's not my interpretation of how they felt.
No, you're enabling them to tell that story.
Absolutely. Unfortunately, some people tend to think, all right, I've just interviewed somebody, I'll put their words into an article and I'll say what. Well, there's a place for that. I'm not saying there isn't a place for that, but it can get interpreted the wrong way. It's much better when it comes to an oral history. It's much better to quote the person for what they said, and you can discuss
you get that authenticity and you get that first-hand experience. And I think that's central to a lot of what we're doing. Across England in this tournament over the next few weeks and months. I
was going to just say one.
Yeah. Just one more thing. Yes. Would you like to add anything else, Harry?
Yeah. I was just going to say with that as well. It's really important to recognise as well that just because one person says something doesn't mean it's the truth. And so I quite like it when I interview, say, 2 or 3 people and they have a different version of the same story, because it sort of proves here that we all have our interpretation. And what that proves more than anything else is that throughout history, when somebody's written the history of something, is it the fact? And so we know that men have tended to write history for the last however many 100 years. We know that men have tended to focus on whatever they focused on, the monarchy or they've not necessarily focused on the stories of the individual people, and they certainly haven't focused on the stories of the individual women. And I think that's the important thing, that you need to get those voices to tell their story. And if they disagree about something, that it's their story. It's not my story, it's their story.
I think that's such an important point to make, and an appropriate place to end this conversation. I know that we could have talked to you a lot longer today, Gary, but thank you so much for your time today and that fascinating insight into your perspective on the game and your research and your current work at Old Trafford. And we wish you all the best with your work on the Euros tournament this year. So thank you very much.
Thanks, and thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.